Alrighty, CNT140. We are working on Chapter 1 of our premise cabling book, Overview of Cabling. So here we have a little bit of history, a little bit about how standards evolved, difference between standards and codes, and kind of getting us going with the 568 standard for cabling. First podcast here, we're going to tackle a bunch of history. History of telecom spans 150 years from telegraph to satellite, etc. Today, technology has changed dramatically quicker, if you will. The pace of change is dramatically quicker, if you will. Let's do a quick buzz back through time. Early on, there were inventors and people that were experimenting with how can we transfer data across some sort of media, like a wire or something. Back in the 1700s, there was a demonstration of actually carrying electrical charge across a thread. Eventually, that's replaced by a wire. We have somebody working on the principle of electromagnetism. Then we have Volta working on basically creating a battery. So we have all these little incremental advances through time. This actually is a neat little YouTube video that shows a battery that's been ringing a bell for the last 175 years or so, and I believe it's still ringing as we talk here. We have another group that are working on telegraph principles, trying to put some of these pieces together. A patent was issued for communication system Cook and Wheatstone that used a 5-needle system to basically create or point to letters, if you will. Early 1800s, then we have Samuel Morse comes up with a combination of things that we now think of as the telegraph. He comes up with a way to send electrical pulse as well as a way to communicate information through dots and dashes. So now the telegraph as we think of it is on the scene in the early 1800s. And the sending unit was this unit here where you would actually click together two contacts. Those contacts would make an electrical circuit, and the receiving end, located usually in the next town, would basically receive that electrical pulse and close two contacts on its end, making a click. So I'm able to send a click from town to town, and all I needed to do was alter the length of them, and I could start sending letters. So I could send a message from town to town. So that was a huge step in being able to transfer information. Here's a close-up look at the contacts, and here's the idea of literally it's going from town to town. A lot of times these telegraph lines ran alongside roads or railroads. That's typically where they would go. Now we have later 1800s. We have Bell is awarded a patent for the first telephone. So now we have somebody that's like, hey, can I take, instead of just electrical charge, can I try to somehow get my voice on the wire? And then we have Alexander Graham Bell getting a notice of his patent. There's a lot of conspiracy that Elijah Gray and Alexander Graham Bell applied for the patent the same day, but Alexander Graham Bell got it. That's a whole big conspiracy there, whole big conspiracy theory there on who actually got the patent, who actually got there first and who actually got the patent. Anyway, we have Bell actually having his version of what we would call the telephone apply for patent. Just a few days later, does a test run and sends a signal basically from room to room saying, hey, Watson, I need you to come over here, kind of thing. And now we have the first voice being transmitted across a wire. Short time later, Bell basically founds the Bell Telephone Company. This is kind of like the first logo, if you will. And here I show you kind of the logos through the years, the whole way up to in early 1980s, if you will, and then becomes AT&T. Next slide here, I have a bunch of, these are pictures I've taken over the years in different places, Baltimore, Shiremanstown, that's outside of Mechanicsburg. And these are manhole covers, utility covers, if you will, that have the Bell System logo in. So there's still remnants of that Bell system around when you look for it. It's one of those neat little tidbits that Mr. Brown looks for. 1875, Edison is working on his own device. Edison was hired by Western Union, which Western Union is known for telegraphs, okay? And Edison created a very good transmitter, basically a good microphone, if you will, and that actually starts helping to increase the technology of the telephone, being able to have a better microphone to pick up the signal. The first switchboard is installed in Boston, 1877. Up until that point, okay, actually, up until that point, we have, if you wanted to call two people, you literally needed a phone to call, person A and a separate phone to call person B. Once the switchboard comes into play, we now have the ability to have one phone and the switchboard make its contact to another phone. But it does lead to this. Lots and lots of phone wires around on telephone poles. And I'm sorry, I got that backwards. Before the switchboard, this is the kind of thing you would have. You would have phone wires everywhere. Once the switchboard comes on the scene, it reduces that wiring significantly in helping progress technology, if you will. So the switchboard comes into play. I kind of got that backwards, I'm sorry. So now what happens is you'll have a single phone line pulled into a neighborhood that multiple neighbors share that phone line, called a party line. And what would happen is you'd pick up your phone and you would literally crank the handle on the side of the phone and ring the switchboard operator, and the switchboard operator would make you connection to who you wanted to call to. But it was a shared environment. You had neighbors sharing the phone line, but that was an inexpensive way to get everybody a phone. This is the type of phone you were dealing with. You literally had a box on the wall that you cranked the handle. When you did, you generated power, and that would ring the bells at the switchboard. The switchboard operator would be sitting behind a panel like so, and would literally plug a wire into your phone and say, hey, how can I help you? And you would say, hey, I want to call, Fred over on 123, Main Street, if you will. And they would say, hold on, and they would literally take a cord and plug your phone. Actually, they'd plug in that person's phone, ring them, and then connect the two people together. And they would literally patch those phones together so they could talk to each other. That was your switchboard operator. So you literally had people patching phone A to phone B based on, who do you want to call? Okay, let me find them and plug into them for you. So here's some switchboards and switchboard operators over the years actually doing the connection of. Short time after that, 50-some thousand phones in the U.S. 1884, first commercial service between New York and Boston. So now we're starting to connect cities. 1885, we said before, AT&T company was founded, American Telephone and Telegraph. Along this time, there is another player that comes onto the scene, Almond Stroger. Legend has it, he was an undertaker in the town, and the other undertaker in the town, that person, we'll call him Frank. Frank's wife worked as a switchboard operator. So anytime a call would come in for an undertaker, that person sitting at the switchboard would route the traffic to obviously her husband and cut out Almond Stroger. He would not get the business, if you will. So, just like human nature, you irritate somebody enough, they're going to go invent something. Almond Stroger, so to speak, went to the basement and started working on creating the first phone switch. He creates this stepping relay that each time an electrical pulse comes into it, this relay clicks a notch. Click, click, click. The idea being, if I dial a digit, the relay would click over to, the fifth phone, and now I could literally talk to that phone directly. I would not need a switchboard operator. So Almond Stroger comes up with this invention, gets the patent for the first phone switch. Now the phone switch is going to have a bank of those, a bank for the first digit, another bank for the second digit, another bank for the third digit. So then you could literally dial the number of the person you wanted to call and not need a switchboard operator. This did require the use of a rotary phone, this type of phone here. If I flip it over and look at the bottom, as I crank this wheel around and let go, the wheel goes back to its starting position, but as it goes, it literally makes contact. If you spin the wheel around to digit 5 and let go, as that wheel goes back to the starting position, it's going to make contact on the bottom 5 times and send five pulses of electricity to the stepping relay so that you could make contact with that person. So this phone then would allow you to send those pulses to the stepping relay. The stepping relay would click that amount of times so you can make connection and talk to that person. So now I have the ability to literally call somebody directly and not need a switchboard operator. Okay, so now we start having this. We literally have individual phone lines to each house. I can pick up my phone, dial a series of numbers, and call somebody's house directly, all because of that stepping relay switch, if you will. Again, 1885, AT&T forms and starts dominating the industry. Yeah, they're pretty much the main player. So the nice part is, they're the main player, so they've figured out all this technology and have it hooked up coast to coast, if you will. But they also essentially start becoming a monopoly because they're the only game in town. Bell Company continued to change, became AT&T. It started buying up smaller competitors. AT&T bought the controlling interest in Western Union, a telegraph company, in 1909. And now that is the ICC, which we would eventually call the FCC. Now it's like, hey, what are you doing over there? What are you doing buying up all these guys? So in 1913, there was an antitrust decision, Kingsbury Commitment, that said, hey, AT&T, knock it off. You stay in your lane. Western Union, you stay in your lane. AT&T, you keep working on your telephone thing. Western Union, you keep working on your telegraph thing. And that kind of forced AT&T to stay in your lane, if you will. 1934, Roosevelt created the FCC and signed into law the Telecommunications Act of 1934. This was a push to get phones and phone lines out to people, especially rurally, and get people connected. Oops, there we go. So now we have AT&T providing local long distance, kind of owning 90% of the market. Are they a monopoly? Yeah, they're now starting to be in the sights of the FCC saying, "Hey, what are you doing with all this?" Now we're going to jump a little bit down the road here. 1960s, we start having the touch-tone phone come on. So instead of the rotary phone, we have a touch-tone where I could dial a digit and the tones are what are sent, and the switch starts recognizing those tones that I can dial, somebody's house instead of using the rotary phone. Many people, we had a rotary and a phone in our house till probably late 80s, early 90s. So this is not something that took off in everybody's houses. It took time to phase this in. But we now start having this scenario where they would put a box in a neighborhood for all the phone lines to connect to, and then they would use a trunk line from that box back to the central office. So instead of running 24 individual phone lines from 24 houses back to the CO, they could run 24 lines to this box. This box would multiplex them together onto a T1 line, a T carrier. T carrier uses time division multiplexing. Hopefully you remember that from 120. And would actually multiplex together those 24 phone calls on one simultaneous trunk line back to the CO, back to the central office. So now we start getting this structure that should kind of start looking like, backbone cabling, fiber cabling between closets, horizontal cabling out to workstations, that kind of structure. Okay, that should start looking familiar to you. A lot of companies at the time were looking at having all these phone lines and they're like, hey, there's got to be a better way to do this. So again, a lot of companies in the 60s bought their own phone switch called a PBX, Private Branch Exchange. All the phones in the company would connect to this phone switch, and a trunk line would go from this phone switch back to the phone company. It was a lot cheaper to have that trunk line and pay for that trunk line than paying for 40, 50, 60 individual phone lines. So a lot of companies operated under this, where the phones in the building would connect to the phone switch, and then the phone switch would connect to the central office. So all of and I think I have a picture here. Here's a picture of a PBX. All the phone calls within the facility ran through the switch and were basically, I'm using air quotes, free calls. And I could even pick up the phone and dial an office number and get that person directly. And if I wanted to call outside the company, I would pick up and hit maybe 9 to get an outside line, and then I could dial outside to, a neighboring business or whatever, that sort of thing. So this was very commonplace for businesses to have their own phone switch on hand. As we move to the mid 80s, we have AT&T being considered a monopoly, and they're being forced to break up. They were basically a monopoly, and they were forced to break up, and we started getting a bunch of these players on the scene. Some of these you might recognize today, but some of these have been merged and bought up over time. But these regions were created across the country, And then over time, this is like a little flow chart of like these companies broke up, and then some of these started merging back together till we have AT&T, Verizon, those kind of things around the country that we recognize. So there's been some mergering after this anyway. All right, when we come back, we'll keep going with our history.